The mountain did not merely freeze the dead that winter, it froze them standing upright, their eyes wide open as they stared into the blinding white storm. It was the autumn of 1883, and the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado were not a landscape that invited permanent settlement so much as tolerated it. The peaks rose to 14,000 feet and higher, ribbed with granite and streaked with old snow that never fully left the upper elevations even in August. The valleys between them were narrow and wind-scoured, and subject to weather that could change from clear autumn sunshine to horizontal sleet in the time it took a person to walk from a barn to a well. The timber was thick at the lower elevations, spruce and fir and stands of aspen that turned gold in September and stood bare and skeletal by late October. Above the tree line, there was nothing between a person and the wind but rock and the memory of having made a decision to live here. The settlers who came to these valleys in the 1880s came for silver, mostly, and for the land that silver money made possible. They built where the land was flat, where the wind seemed manageable, and where the creek ran close enough to reach without climbing. They built, in other words, where building made sense to people who understood construction as a matter of level ground and straight walls and a roof pitched against the snow. Ingrid Vester did not build where building made sense. She was 36 years old in the autumn of 1883, Norwegian by birth, widowed once, and not inclined to repeat the experience of depending on another person's continued survival for the structure of her own. Her husband, Eric Vester, had died in February of 1881 inches. A tragic mine collapse at the Silver Queen claimed 6 miles north of the valley. The sudden death had left her with 50 acres of land on the western slope above Cascade Creek, a half-finished log cabin frame, 2 mules, a milk cow, a modest sum of money from the mine settlement, $65, and a set of decisions that no one in the valley believed she was equipped to make alone. She had one child, a boy named Christian, 8 years old, who had his father's coloring and his mother's silence. The boy followed her everywhere that autumn and said little, watching everything with the careful attention of a child who has already learned that the world can take things from you without warning. The Cascade Creek Valley was a place where widows were expected to sell out quickly and return east, or else marry a neighboring rancher to secure a roof over their heads. But Ingrid was not cut from the same cloth as the town's dependents. She had spent her early life in the coastal fishing ports of Norway, where women watched their husbands sail into the North Sea and never return. She knew how to stand on her own feet, how to face a cold wind without flinching, and how to make a dollar stretch further than any man in the settlement could imagine. Her decision to build a new life on her western slope property was not a sudden burst of grief-stricken stubbornness, but a cold, calculated plan for her son's future. She looked at her $65, her 50 acres of mountain rock, and her small boy, and she knew that if she built a standard cabin on the flat land like everyone else, the winter would devour her resources before the spring could rescue her. She needed a way to outsmart the mountain, to build a shelter that required no constant upkeep, no endless cutting of wood, and no struggle against the relentless wind. So, as the golden aspen leaves began to drift down the mountain slopes and the first skim of ice formed on the edges of Cascade Creek, she took her measuring rope, her hand level, and her son, and she set out to find a place where she could stand against the coming winter, without begging for help from a soul in the valley. It was a quiet determination that drove her up the steep trails day after day, ignoring the pitying looks of the travelers who passed her on the Lower Creek Road. She was ready. Before we go any further, if you are watching this, do us a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because every week we bring you real survival techniques and historically inspired stories from the American frontier. Techniques that actually worked when comfort wasn't optional, it was survival. And drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. We want to know if you're dealing with winter cold right now, or if you've got your own tricks for keeping warm. Now, let's talk about what Ingrid found and why nobody believed it would work. While the rest of the Cascade Creek settlers spent their September days clearing the flat pine bottoms near the water, dragging heavy spruce logs with teams of oxen, and complaining about the mud, Ingrid Vester walked the steep western cliff face. The neighbors watched her from below, whispering to one another as they raised their traditional rectangular cabins. They built on the flat banks because that was what they knew, stacking logs in straight, level lines, believing that proximity to the creek was more important than shelter from the wind. Among them was Silas Thorne, a 45-year-old surveyor and local construction authority who had designed most of the cabins in the district. Silas was a man of precise lines and conventional wisdom, and he took it upon himself to advise the newcomers where to build. He had already marked out several level plots on the valley floor, urging the settlers to steer clear of the steep slopes. But Ingrid ignored his suggestions, walking higher and higher up the mountain, carrying only her rope and her hand level, with Christian scrambling silently behind her. It was on a sharp, clear Tuesday morning that she found the crevice. It was a remarkable geological formation, situated roughly 110 feet above the creek, on a sheer granite cliff face. The rock had fractured along a vertical joint centuries ago, and the relentless action of frost and rain had weathered it into a deep, narrow slot. The crevice ran approximately 26 feet deep into the solid mountain stone, measuring 13 feet wide at its mouth and narrowing to roughly 9 feet at the back wall. The vertical walls of the slot rose 16 feet high before the rock leaned inward, creating a natural, heavy overhang of solid granite that covered more than 2/3 of the interior space. The floor of the slot was remarkably level, composed of packed stone and old sediment, requiring only the clearing of loose debris rather than extensive grading. To the average settler, it was nothing more than a dangerous fissure in the mountain, a place where a wild animal might den or where a rockfall might trap a careless hunter. But to Ingrid, with her shipbuilding heritage, it was 3 massive, draft-proof walls and a nearly complete stone roof already built by the mountain itself. She stood at the mouth of the crevice, looking in, feeling the still air inside, while the autumn wind howled across the cliff, face just inches away. She knew that if she could seal the open front of this natural stone slot, she would have a shelter that no wind could shake, no snow could collapse, and no winter could easily penetrate. She reached her arm into the gaps of the rock, testing the stability of the granite, checking for loose layers, and pressing her face against the cool stone, as if listening to its ancient strength. Christian sat on a flat rock nearby, his small face serious, watching his mother measure the width of the mouth with her rope. He did not ask why they were climbing so high, or why they were not building near the other families down by the creek. He simply trusted her. Ingrid finished her measurements, knotted her rope at the 13-foot mark, and knew she had found her home. It would require less than a quarter of the timber needed for a standard cabin, saving her precious dollars and her limited physical strength. But more importantly, it would place her and her son inside the mountain, protected on 3 sides by millions of tons of solid rock that would never shift or draft. She looked down at the valley below, where the other cabins stood exposed on the flat ground, their chimneys already smoking in the cool air, and she knew she had made the right choice, regardless of what the neighbors would say when they saw what she was building. Silas Thorne rode up the steep trail to the western slope on an afternoon in late September, his horse struggling slightly on the loose shale. He had heard the rumors at the trading post, and like the rest of the settlement, he believed the widow Vester was making a disastrous mistake out of sheer grief and financial desperation. He found Ingrid at the mouth of the crevice, her sleeves rolled up, working with her son to clear loose granite stones from the interior floor. They were hauling the rocks out in a canvas sling, stacking them in a neat pile near the edge of the path. Silas dismounted, tied his horse to a nearby scrub oak, and walked to the mouth of the natural stone slot. He stood there for several minutes, his surveyor's eye taking in the vertical walls, the natural overhang, and the narrowness of the space. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the calm, authoritative tone of a man who believed his experience was absolute. He told her that the crevice was a trap. He explained that stone was not a building material the way she seemed to think it was, and that the granite walls would act as a permanent cold sink, drawing whatever heat she generated out of the cabin and dumping it into the mountain. He pointed to the natural overhang, warning her that winter ice would accumulate in the fissures above, and the immense weight of the snowpack would eventually cause the rock to calve off in unpredictable, lethal slabs, crushing whatever timber roof she tried to construct underneath. He argued that the narrow floor would be permanently freezing because she could not insulate the stone from below, and that Cascade Creek's spring snowmelt would channel directly down the cliff face, turning her living space into a wet, muddy trench. Finally, he warned her about the fire hazard, claiming that a stovepipe in such a narrow, enclosed space would be impossible to vent safely, risking suffocation for her and the boy. He finished his assessment by offering to help her select a proper building site on the flat valley floor, where the soil was deep enough for a standard log foundation, and where she could build a sensible home like the other families. Ingrid listened to every word he said, her face expressionless, her hands resting on the handles of the canvas sling. She did not argue with his calculations, nor did she try to explain her Norwegian heritage or the stone houses of the Lofoten Islands. She simply thanked him for his concern, her voice level and polite, and then she said that she did not need the Cascade Creek water to drain away from her cabin because the water would never reach it. Silas stared at her, frustrated by her stubbornness, unable to understand how a woman with so little resources could decline the help of the district's most experienced surveyor. He shook his head, muttered a brief warning about the coming frosts, and rode back down the mountain, leaving her to her work. By the end of the week, the story of their encounter had reached the general store at the settlement, and the neighbors wasted no time in rendering their judgment. The children were the first to call the Crevice cabin the Badger Hole, and the name caught on immediately, spreading from the schoolyard to the Sunday gathering until everyone in the valley was using it. They talked about her at the feed store and around the blacksmith's forge, saying it was a pity that a woman would let her pride endanger her only child. They believed she was hiding from the world, unable to face the reality of her husband's death, and that her refusal to build a conventional cabin was a clear sign of a breaking mind. The women of the settlement whispered about her when they gathered to sew, saying that someone ought to step in and take the boy before the winter locked them in that cold stone fissure. But Ingrid remained isolated on her western slope, ignoring the gossip that drifted up from the valley, focusing every ounce of her strength on the single timber wall that would seal her family inside the mountain. The physical labor of building the front wall of the Crevice cabin began in earnest as the October winds grew colder and the aspens lost the last of their gold. Ingrid Vester had only $65 in her own hands, but she possessed a skill that none of the valley's experienced carpenters understood. She knew the art of the scribe, a technique her father had used in the Norwegian shipyards to fit irregular timber planks to the curved, complex hulls of sailing vessels. In the mountains of Colorado, where log cabins were built with straight logs and squared corners, the idea of fitting wood directly to living rock was considered impossible. But Ingrid did not see the granite walls of the Crevice as an obstacle. She saw them as a guide. She began by selecting a series of heavy spruce logs, which she hauled up the steep path from the lower slope using her 2 mules. Each log had to be positioned across the 13-foot mouth of the crevice, then carefully measured against the uneven, jagged granite face on either side. Ingrid did not use a saw to cut the log ends flat. Instead, she used a specialized scribing tool, a double-pointed iron compass she had carried with her from Bergen. With one point of the compass resting against the irregular rock wall and the other against the end of the spruce log, she dragged the tool downward, tracing every bump, curve, and recess of the granite onto the wood. Once the line was marked, she used her hand axe and a sharp adze to carefully chip away the wood along the traced contour, creating a perfect, customized mirror image of the rock face on the log end. It was slow, painstaking work that required immense patience and a steady hand. If she cut too deep, the log would not fit tightly. If she cut too shallow, the air would leak through the seams. Christian sat nearby on the gravel floor of the crevice, his small hands busy sorting the smaller stones they had cleared from the interior. He helped his mother by carrying buckets of coarse gravel from the creek bed to spread over the floor, creating a dry, level base for their eventual timber decking. The boy worked without complaint, his small face serious, watching how his mother handled the heavy tools with such deliberate, quiet skill. Each scribed log was raised into position across the mouth of the crevice, then tapped into place with a heavy wooden mallet. The fit was so tight that the wood seemed to grow directly out of the granite, leaving no gap wider than a pencil lead. The other settlers, watching from the lower trail as they hauled their own massive timber supplies, could not understand why she was spending so much time on a single wall. They believed she was wasting her energy on unnecessary details, and that her slow progress would leave her exposed when the first true blizzard arrived. But Ingrid knew that on the frontier, speed was often the enemy of survival. A quickly built cabin with straight walls and loose chinking would eventually let the wind in, and once the wind entered, no amount of firewood could keep the interior warm. She focused entirely on the precision of her scribes, ensuring that her single front wall was as tight as a ship's hull, sealed against the elements by the very rock that surrounded it. By the middle of October, the first 6 courses of logs were in place, standing solid and draft-proof across the crevice mouth, and the mountain began to feel like a home. By the 3rd week of October, the timber front wall of the crevice cabin stood 10 feet high, completely sealing the mouth of the natural stone slot. It was the only wall of the structure exposed to the outside world, and Ingrid had engineered it to be virtually impenetrable to the cold. The wall was 10 inches thick, double-framed with a heavy inner and outer layer of spruce planks. Between these 2 wooden faces, she had created a dead-air insulation cavity, which she and Christian packed tightly, with a mixture of dried mountain moss, wild sheep's wool salvaged from the briars, and dry forest grass. This created an insulation barrier that far outperformed the simple log walls of the valley's conventional cabins, stopping conductive heat loss before it could reach the interior. The door was positioned dead center, constructed of double-thickness pine planks bolted together and fitted with a heavy wooden latch that pulled the door tight against a felt-trimmed frame. To the left of the door, she set her single window, small and deeply recessed into the thick wall. She had fitted the window with a solid, hinged wooden shutter that could be barred from the inside during storms, completely sealing the cabin from wind-driven snow. The chinking between the spruce logs and the living rock was packed with a specialized mixture of mountain clay, pine pitch, and shredded cedar bark, a compound that remained flexible in the cold and would not shrink or crack as the logs settled against the granite. To address the water issue that Silas Thorne had warned her about, Ingrid spent 3 days working on the rock face above the cabin. She climbed onto the natural granite overhang above the crevice, using her heavy hammer and a series of cold steel chisels to carve a deep, sloped diversion channel directly into the stone. The channel ran diagonally across the face of the cliff, positioned to intercept any rainwater or snowmelt running down the mountain slope and directed outward, letting it cascade harmlessly over the sides of the cliff, far from her timber front wall. It was exhausting work that left her arms aching and her hands blistered, but she knew that water was the ultimate destroyer of wood and chinking, and that keeping her single front wall dry was the key to its longevity. Inside the crevice, she addressed the cold stone floor by constructing a raised timber deck. She first laid a thick, 6-inch bed of dry pine boughs, wild hay, and sweet straw across the cleared stone surface. This created a natural, highly effective barrier that stopped the cold from the bedrock from conducting upward into her living space. Over this insulation layer, she laid heavy, hand-hewn spruce planks, nailing them tightly to a framework of low joists. The floor was solid, dry, and insulated, smelling of fresh pine and dried summer grass. Christian helped her pack the clay mortar around the edges of the floor where the wood met the granite walls, ensuring that no draft could rise from the stone below. She built 2 simple bunk frames against the left granite wall, using spruce poles and woven rope webbing to support their straw-stuffed mattresses. The back wall of the crevice, narrowing to 9 feet, was left as bare rock, a smooth face of dark granite that had been scrubbed clean of soot and lichen. The cabin was compact, measuring only 11 feet wide at the front and narrowing toward the back. But the 16-foot ceiling gave the space an open, airy feeling that prevented claustrophobia. It was a shelter reduced to its absolute essentials, built with a precision that left no room for failure. And as Ingrid closed the heavy front door for the first time, she felt the immediate stillness of the mountain embracing her. In late October, Ingrid made her final major purchase from the settlement store, spending $15 of her $65 on a small, heavy iron cook stove. The stove was compact, barely 2 feet square, but it was constructed of thick, high-quality cast iron that could hold heat long after the fire had died. With the help of her 2 mules and a sturdy wooden sled, she hauled the stove up the western slope and into the crevice. She positioned the stove directly against the right sandstone wall of the cabin, placing it on a flat hearth of local slate she had laid over her timber floor. The placement of the stove was a deliberate choice. Ingrid did not install it in the center of the room or near the timber front wall. She placed it directly against the living rock. She understood that stone has a remarkable capacity to absorb and store thermal energy, acting as a massive heat battery. When she lit a fire in the iron stove, the heat would not merely warm the interior air and escape through the roof. Instead, the radiant energy would be absorbed by the 2-foot-thick sandstone and granite walls of her cabin. The stone would charge slowly throughout the day, and then, during the cold nighttime hours, it would release that stored warmth back into the room, maintaining a stable temperature long after the stove fire had gone out. The stovepipe was run vertically along the rock face, secured to the granite with forged iron brackets she had driven into natural crevices, then angled outward to exit through a fitted, insulated collar in the timber front wall above the door. Ingrid packed the gap around the pipe with clay and mineral wool, ensuring that no heat could escape and no moisture could enter through the penetration. The stove drew beautifully, the draft strong and steady, pulling fresh air in through a small, adjustable vent she had cut near the bottom of her door and exhausting the smoke clean through the chimney. In the deep, protected outer portion of the crevice, just beyond her timber front wall, Ingrid constructed her firewood storage. The natural overhang of the cliff face extended several feet beyond the front of her cabin, creating a dry, wind-sheltered vestibule. Here, she stacked her seasoned pine and Douglas fir, splitting each log into narrow pieces and standing them on end to allow air to circulate freely. The wood sat protected from direct snow and rain, while the natural, gentle air currents that moved through the crevice kept the fuel bone dry, lowering its moisture content to under 15%. Most settlers in the valley stored their wood outside under rough canvas tarps or open lentos, where it inevitably absorbed moisture from the damp winter air and became ice-logged by mid-December. They spent their winter mornings prying frozen logs apart with axes, trying to light fires with wood that was too damp to burn effectively. But Ingrid's woodpile remained dry, light, and ready to burn at peak efficiency, requiring only a fraction of the energy to catch fire. She had created an integrated system where her fuel, her stove, and her stone walls worked together to maximize every single heat unit she produced. As the October days gave way to November, and the first heavy frost coated the valley in a silver blanket, Ingrid knew she had done everything to prepare. Her $65 were nearly gone, but her cabin was finished, her wood was dry, and her son was safe inside a shelter that was as solid as the mountain itself. The true test of the crevice cabin arrived on the morning of the 14th of December 1883, with a suddenness that caught the Cascade Creek Valley completely unprepared. A massive, slow-moving Arctic high-pressure system had dropped out of western Canada, slipping over the Rockies and settling like a heavy frozen weight across southwestern Colorado. The barometer dropped precipitously overnight, and by dawn, the temperature had fallen to 14 below zero. By noon, it was 22 below, and the wind had risen to a sustained 45 miles per hour, with gusts screaming down from the high peaks at over 60 miles per hour. It was the kind of cold that turns diesel and oil to gel, that makes steel brittle enough to shatter under a hammer, and that turns exposed human flesh white with frostbite in under 3 minutes. The wind turned the fine, dry snow into horizontal knives, scouring the landscape, burying fences, and reducing visibility to less than 5 feet. Across the valley, the settlers were instantly driven into survival mode. They abandoned their outdoor chores, retreated into their cabins, and began a desperate, around-the-clock struggle to keep their fireplaces and stoves fed. For the standard log cabins built on the flat valley bottoms, the storm was an unmitigated disaster. These structures had been built for convenience, with straight log walls and standard chinking, exposed to the full force of the mountain winds on all 4 sides. As the wind slammed into the timber walls, it scoured the heat away through convective cooling, pulling thermal energy out of the cabins faster than any stove could replace it. The air inside the valley homes dropped rapidly, hovering in the high 30s near the floor and barely reaching 50 near the ceiling. At the cabin of Maeve Fletcher on the lower creek, the wind found every tiny gap in the chinking that had seemed tight in October. Cold drafts scoured across the floorboards, snuffing out candles 6 feet from the hearth and turning the indoor water bucket into a solid block of ice. Maeve and her husband huddled near their fireplace, wrapping their children in every wool blanket and quilt they owned, taking turns to stoke the fire every 20 minutes. But their woodpile was stored outside under a snow-laden canvas tarp, and every log they brought inside was coated in ice and damp from weeks of exposure. When thrown onto the fire, the damp wood hissed and steamed, producing a thick, bitter smoke that filled the cabin but gave off only half the heat of dry fuel. The chimney, cooled by the extreme outside air, began to draft poorly, forcing the smoke back into the living room and leaving the family coughing and choking in the dim, freezing space. It was a pattern repeated in nearly every conventional home in the valley. The settlers were burning through their precious cordwood at twice their normal rate, watching their winter supplies vanish in days, while their homes remained cold, damp, and miserable. The wind was a relentless enemy, and it was winning the battle of attrition, probing every seam, stripping every wall, and leaving families shivering in the dark. But up on the eastern slope, 80 feet above the frozen creek, the badger hole sat silent and undisturbed, protected by the very mountain that the other settlers had believed would destroy it. In the valley below Cascade Creek, the blizzard of 1883 had turned into a relentless, six-front war for survival. A conventional freestanding cabin is, by its very nature, an exposed target. Heat inside the building is constantly fighting to escape, through 6 different pathways, 4 vertical walls, a sloped roof, and an uninsulated floor. In normal winter conditions, a well-stoked fire can manage this loss, but when the temperature drops to 28 below zero and the wind runs at 45 miles per hour, the thermodynamics of standard log construction fail catastrophically. At the home of Jared Vance, a sturdy rectangular cabin built with 12-inch spruce logs, the family was in a state of quiet panic. Jared had spent his autumn stacking what he believed was a generous wood pile, but the extreme wind convective cooling was stripping heat from his cabin walls at a rate he had never anticipated. The logs, though thick, had no internal insulation cavity and possessed virtually no thermal storage capacity. As the outside air scoured the logs, the cold conducted straight through the wood, turning the interior log faces into blocks of ice that radiated a bone-chilling cold into the living room. The floor was worse. Built on low wooden piers over the frozen ground, the floorboards had no protection from the wind that swept underneath the cabin. The temperature at floor level dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing the water in Christian's dog's bowl, and causing Jared's youngest daughter to suffer mild frostbite on her toes, while she slept under 4 wool blankets. To fight the draft, Jared was forced to feed his stone fireplace continuously, burning through 40 to 50 logs a day. His wood pile, stored outside under a rough lean-to, had been buried under 4 feet of wind-driven snow. What he could dig out was damp and ice-logged, the moisture having penetrated deep into the wood fibers during the autumn rains. When thrown onto the coals, the wood hissed and steamed, the fire spending most of its energy simply boiling off the water before the timber could even begin to combust. This produced a thick, heavy creosote that quickly coated the inside of his cold stone chimney, reducing the draft and forcing a bitter, acrid smoke back into the cabin. Jared's wife, Maeve, spent the second night of the storm walking the floor, coughing from the smoke, wrapping her children's feet in sheepskin, and stuffing rags into the gaps along the baseboards that continued to open as the log walls shifted in the extreme cold. It was a miserable, exhausting struggle that left the family depleted of energy and low on fuel after only 48 hours of the storm. Even Silas Thorne, who had prided himself on his precise, professionally designed cabin, was struggling. His modern stove, though large, was consuming wood at 3 times its normal rate, and his indoor temperature hovered in the low 40s. The radiant cold from his log walls was so intense that he had to position his family's bedrolls in a tight semicircle within 3 feet of the stove, leaving the rest of his spacious cabin abandoned to the frost. He sat by his fire, setting his alarm for every 45 minutes to stoke the grate, his face gray with exhaustion, listening to the wind rattle his timber walls, and wondering how the other families in the valley were faring. He thought of the widow Ingrid Vester in her badger hole on the western slope, and he believed with absolute certainty that she and her son must be freezing to death in that cold stone fissure. He resolved that as soon as the wind dropped, he would lead a rescue party up the mountain to bring them down, believing that her stubborn refusal of his advice had surely ended in tragedy. While the valley below Cascade Creek fought its desperate, freezing battle, the interior of the Crevice cabin existed in a state of quiet, almost unnatural peace. Ingrid Vester's shelter was not fighting a six-front war against the wind. It was fighting a one-front war. The left wall of the cabin was solid granite. The right wall was sandstone. The back wall was granite. And the ceiling was the massive, natural overhang of the mountain itself. These 5 surfaces were not exposed to the sub-zero wind or the freezing air. They were in direct contact with the immense thermal mass of the mountain, which remained at a stable geothermal baseline of 45 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the storm outside. The mountain was not cold. It was a constant, reliable reservoir of moderate warmth. Ingrid's cabin did not need to be heated from sub-zero to comfortable. It only needed to be warmed from 45 degrees to comfortable, a difference of 15 degrees rather than 70. On the coldest night of the storm, when the thermometer outside registered 28 below zero and the wind howled across the cliff face above, Ingrid fed her small cast-iron stove only twice. She used small, split Douglas fir logs from her dry vestibule pile, wood that burned hot, clean, and completely without smoke due to its low moisture content. The iron stove radiated heat, which was quickly absorbed by the sandstone and granite walls of the crevice. The stone acted as a natural thermal battery, charging slowly and then releasing a gentle, constant warmth back into the room. There were no drafts in the cabin because there were no seams to open. The scribed timber front wall met the rock with an airtight seal that the wind could not penetrate. The air inside the cabin remained perfectly still and dry, the planned ventilation. Fresh air entered near the floor, and stale air was exhausted through the chimney without creating drafts. Christian spent the afternoon of the 3rd day sitting on his bunk, reading a book by the light of a single oil lamp. He was wearing only a simple wool shirt, with his sleeves pushed up, his fingers warm and relaxed, completely comfortable in his shirt sleeves. The floor beneath his feet, insulated by the thick bed of pine boughs and dry hay, was warm to the touch. The water bucket beside the door remained liquid, showing not a trace of ice on its surface. Ingrid sat at the small wooden table, mending a pair of socks, listening to the distant roar of the wind above the cliff face. It was a sound that felt incredibly far away, like a river heard from deep inside a cave, unable to reach them, unable to disturb the stillness of their sanctuary. She had burned only 10 small logs over the past 24 hours, less than a quarter of the wood her neighbors were consuming in a single afternoon. Her fuel supply, stored dry and accessible inside the crevice mouth, remained virtually untouched. She looked at her son, his face relaxed and healthy, showing no signs of the cold or the cough that had plagued him the previous winter, and she knew that her grandfather's wisdom had saved them. The mountain had done the work for her. It had held the cold back, stored the warmth, and provided a sanctuary that no blizzard could ever penetrate. While the experienced builders of the valley had trusted their traditional timber walls and suffered for it, Ingrid had trusted the rock, and the rock had not betrayed her. She put her hand against the granite wall beside her chair, feeling the solid, stable warmth of the earth, and she felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. They were not merely surviving the winter. They were living in it, safe and warm in the heart of the mountain. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of December 19th, the wind dropping away to a gentle breeze and the sky clearing to a brilliant, blinding blue. Across the Cascade Creek Valley, the settlers emerged from their cabins, looking haggard, exhausted, and deeply depleted. They found their valley transformed into an Arctic wasteland, with snowdrifts piled 8 feet high against the north walls of their homes, and their precious firewood supplies dangerously low. Nearly every family had burned through 3 weeks of fuel in just 5 days, and what remained was frozen solid under the snow, requiring back-breaking labor to retrieve and split. Silas Thorne, despite his own exhaustion, gathered 3 other men from the settlement to form a rescue party. He was convinced that the widow Ingrid Vester and her son Christian had frozen to death in their badger hole on the western slope, and he believed it was his duty to bring their bodies down. The men struggled up the steep path through waist-deep snow, carrying shovels, blankets, and flasks of warm tea. As they climbed higher, the wind dropped away, the sheer granite cliffs of the western slope blocking the cold air currents just as Ingrid had calculated. When they finally reached the shelf below the crevice, Silas stopped, his eyes wide with disbelief. The badger hole did not look like a disaster site. The massive snowdrifts that had buried the valley cabins had bypassed the crevice mouth, directed over the cliff face by the natural geometry of the slot. A neat, small path had been shoveled from the timber front wall to the edge of the path, and beside the door, Ingrid's firewood stack remained dry, organized, and virtually untouched. There was no thick column of smoke pouring from the chimney, only a thin, nearly invisible trail of heat rising into the clear air. Silas walked to the door, his heart pounding, and knocked. Ingrid opened it almost immediately. She was wearing only her normal house dress, her sleeves rolled up, her face relaxed and showing not a trace of the exhaustion that lined Silas's own eyes. Behind her, Christian was sitting at the table, helping himself to a bowl of warm oatmeal, his cheeks pink and healthy. The wave of warmth that rolled out of the cabin hit Silas like a physical blow. It was not the dry, smoky heat of a cabin struggling to stay warm. It was a stable, comfortable, ambient warmth that smelled of pine, dry hay, and clean wood smoke. Silas stood in the doorway, his hat in his hand, his mouth open, unable to find his words. "Mrs. Vester," he finally managed, his voice cracking slightly in the cold air. "We thought you might need." "Come in, Silas," Ingrid said, stepping aside to let the men enter. The rescue party filed into the small room, their heavy coats and blankets feeling suddenly ridiculous in the comfortable warmth. They stood in the center of the cabin, looking at the smooth, dry rock walls, the insulated timber floor, and the tiny iron stove that held only a few glowing coals. Silas pulled his spirit thermometer from his coat pocket, his hands trembling slightly as he watched the mercury rise. He held it up for the other men to see. The temperature inside the crevice cabin, 14 hours after Ingrid's last small fire had died down, read 58 degrees Fahrenheit. It was dry, clean, and draft-proof, completely free of the frost and condensation that coated the interior of every log cabin in the valley below. Silas walked the perimeter of the room, touching the sandstone and granite walls, feeling the gentle, stable warmth radiated by the stone thermal battery, and he knew that his professional understanding of building had been completely undone by a widow with a scribing tool and a pile of riverstone. Silas Thorne spent the next 2 hours inside the crevice cabin, conducting a detailed, organized investigation that would change his understanding of construction forever. He was not a man to ignore facts, even when those facts humbled his professional pride, and he knew that what he was witnessing was a fundamental improvement in heat retention. He asked Ingrid's permission to take measurements, which she granted with her usual quiet politeness, continuing her chores while the surveyor worked. Thorne used his calibrated spirit thermometer to record temperatures in every corner of the room, finding a variance of less than 4 degrees between the floor and the ceiling. The insulation layer of pine boughs and hay beneath the spruce planks had stopped the bedrock cold completely, maintaining the floor temperature at an extraordinary 52 degrees. He then went outside to inspect the wood pile in the crevice vestibule, measuring the moisture content of her split pine with his hand. The wood was dry, light, and seasoned under the natural rock overhang, completely free of the ice and frost that had ruined the valley's fuel supplies. He calculated her total consumption over the 5 days of the blizzard, finding that Ingrid had burned less than 1/4 of a cord of wood, while Jared Vance had consumed nearly 1.5 cords to keep his drafty cabin barely above freezing. The data was clear, precise, and undeniable. Thorne wrote the numbers in his surveyor's notebook. Outdoor temp, -28 degrees Fahrenheit. Jared Vance's cabin, 1.5 cords consumed. Average temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Ingrid Vester's cabin, 0.22 cords consumed. Average temperature 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The badger hole, the structure he had called a dangerous trap, had outperformed the valley's best-constructed log cabins by a margin of 20 degrees while consuming 80% less fuel. It was an extraordinary achievement, accomplished not with expensive materials or complex structures, but with the simple, elegant application of ancient physics. Silas closed his notebook, turned to Ingrid, and said the words she had been waiting months to hear. He told her that he had been wrong, completely and utterly wrong, and that her cabin was the finest, safest, and most intelligent shelter in the entire San Juan district. He thanked her for her patience with his arrogance, his voice carrying a genuine humility that surprised the other men in his party. The rescue party rode back down the mountain that afternoon, their blankets and shovels unused, but their minds filled with a new respect for the widow on the western slope. That evening, Silas gathered the settlers at the Trading Post Community Hall to present his findings. He stood before the crowd, his surveyor's notebook open, and read the side-by-side data comparison to a room that had gone completely silent. He did not attempt to shield his own reputation. He admitted his failure openly, telling the ranchers that they had mistaken familiarity for expertise and that Ingrid Vester had outsmarted them all by working with the mountain instead of fighting it. The mockery that had surrounded the badger hole for months died instantly, replaced by a deep, grudging respect. The families who had pitied her now looked to her for survival strategies, realizing that her planned design was the only thing that had kept her family comfortable through a storm that had nearly broken the rest of the settlement. Ingrid had won her battle, not through argument or confrontation, but through the quiet, indisputable proof of her own comfort. The spring of 1884 arrived with the slow, muddy release of the high-altitude snowpack, but the lessons of the previous winter remained locked in the minds of the Cascade Creek settlers. The skepticism that had once defined the valley's attitude toward Ingrid Vester had transformed into an organized eagerness to learn from her. Silas Thorne was the first to act, spending his spring surveying the western slopes with a new purpose, no longer looking for flat, cleared ground, but searching for the natural shelter of rock crevices and cliff overhangs. He identified two promising formations, a wide sandstone shelf on the Henderson Claim and a deep, sheltered recess on the south face above Colburn's store. Working closely with Ingrid and the homeowners, Silas designed hybrid structures that incorporated her double wall and thermal mass principles. They did not attempt to build standard freestanding cabins. They dug into the rock, using the living stone of the mountain as their back and side walls, and building only the south-facing front walls of timber. The construction was a community effort, with neighbors who had once mocked the badger hole now helping haul riverstone and split spruce logs up the steep slopes. Ingrid walked the sites with Silas, showing the men how to scribe the timber ends to the uneven granite faces, how to pack the insulation cavities with dry wool and moss, and how to carve diversion channels above the overhangs to bypass the spring snowmelt. The new builds were completed by late September, and though they lacked the perfect depth of Ingrid's original crevice, both proved remarkably warm through the subsequent winter. They consumed less than half the firewood of conventional cabins and survived 60-mile-an-hour winds with ease, their rock walls holding the heat and releasing it steadily through the sub-zero nights. The structural shift in the Cascade Creek Valley was quiet, but permanent. Traditional log cabins on flat ground were no longer seen as the only proper way to build. Instead, settlers began to view the mountain landscape as an ally, a natural partner that offered baseline warmth and wind protection if they only had the humility to ask for it. For Ingrid, the success of the new builds was the final, emotional vindication of her struggle. She had not built her cabin to prove her superiority or to revolutionize frontier architecture. She had built it to keep her son alive, and she had succeeded. Christian grew up healthy and strong in the dry, stable warmth of their stone sanctuary, his winter cough fully cured, his eyes bright with the confidence of a child who knew his home was safe. They lived in the Crevice cabin for 11 years, through some of the most severe winters southwestern Colorado had ever produced, and they never once ran short of fuel, never once woke to frozen blankets, and never once felt the bitter chill of the mountain wind. Ingrid spent her evenings sitting by the window, watching the sunset coat the eastern peaks in gold, her hand resting on the warm granite wall beside her chair, feeling a deep, abiding peace that she had paid for with her own labor. When she finally sold the property in the late 1890s to move to Durango, she left behind a legacy that would outlast her name. The single timber wall, fitted into the mouth of the granite slot, stood for over 30 years, documented by geological survey teams who marveled at its preservation and its thermal efficiency. The mountain had held her home, protected her son, and taught an entire valley that sometimes the smartest way forward is to look backward, to remember the ancient wisdom of the earth, and to build where the shelter is already waiting. Ingrid Vester's Crevice cabin stood on the western slope of the San Juan Mountains for decades, a quiet monument to a mother's love and the timeless power of working with nature rather than against it. Long after the silver boom faded and the settlers moved away, the hand-scribed timber wall remained wedged in the granite, holding its ground against every blizzard that swept through the high passes. For the families of Cascade Creek, the Badger Hole ceased to be a joke and became a lesson in humility. It proved that true security on the frontier was never a matter of building the loudest or most conventional structure, but of having the quiet wisdom to recognize when the earth had already done the hardest part of the work. If you are planning your own off-grid sanctuary or looking for ways to adapt traditional wisdom to your modern life, take inspiration from Ingrid's story. Sometimes, the most resilient path forward is to stop fighting the elements in the open, find where the natural shelter is already offered, and simply close the door. Thank you for watching. If Ingrid's journey spoke to you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more forgotten frontier stories, and share your own experiences with winter survival in the comments below. Stay warm out there,